on the dressing table in the hotel room and looked in the mirror at a face that had noticeably aged over the past few hours. Gone is the navy blazer and white shirt with blue stripes from Brooks Brothers. Shame was an emotion filling my face. Anger and sadness were also there, but in the reflection, a drunk woman looked at me, ashamed of the creature I helped become. As always, when I did something shameful, I remembered the terrible accident that happened 2 years ago. Just as I was thinking, "What a nightmare," I heard my wife call from the hotel bedroom, "Hurry up, Dave." I splashed some water on my face and dried myself before opening the bathroom door and walking towards the bed. "I thought you'd be naked," Dee said with a hoarse pout in her voice. Dee was simply beautiful. She's smart, hard-working, and has a great body. She stopped taking the pills a week ago, and we planned to start our family that night. I asked, "If he invited you, would you be with him now?" Dee begged, "Please take off your clothes. I want our child." "This is weird," I asked again. "If Mark had chosen you instead of Linda, would you have left the club with him?" "You can do anything tonight. I want you to get me pregnant tonight." "I deserve to know," I continued. "If Mark had chosen you, would you have been at his house in his bed?" Dee exploded. "You don't understand anything about women. Every woman in the club hoped that he would choose her. Of course I would go with him. It would be a once-in-a-lifetime experience of sex with a sports superstar. And then it would be over, and I would return home and continue to love you as always." Dee's face was red, and I suspected that thoughts of sex with me were quickly evaporating, especially after I asked, "You would have come home and probably been pregnant with his child. Would you expect me to raise his child because it was the result of a once-in-a-lifetime experience with a sports superstar?" She was stunned and realized she had made mistakes when I locked myself in the bathroom again. Dee knocked softly on the door and apologized, begging me to come out. I sat on the toilet, my mind swirled, and my heart ached. Honestly, my heart ached for Jim as the full extent of my actions continued to seep into my alcoholic brain. I'm not sure how long the knocking continued, but eventually it stopped. I assumed that Dee was sitting on the edge of the bed, knowing that I would have to leave the bathroom sooner or later. My shirt and jacket were hanging on the back of the bathroom door. I quickly got dressed and, after checking myself in the mirror, opened the door. Dee almost jumped out of bed. "I'm sorry. This whole evening was crazy. What happened tonight concerns Jim and Linda. This doesn't concern us. Let's calm down, have a glass of wine, and talk." I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I let out a long sigh. "Dee, what happened tonight affects us greatly, and I need to think about it before we talk. The only thing you said that I need to respond to is that I don't understand women." It took a moment to collect my thoughts before I continued, "But I understand myself. I want you to start taking your pills again. I'm not ready for kids, and after what happened tonight, I honestly don't know if I ever will." "You can't be serious," Dee was shocked. "I think about Jim all the time. He will survive this. They will stay together." Dee almost screamed with confidence. The sound I made was similar to laughing, but not quite. "I think you're half right. Jim is devoted to his children in a way I have never seen. There is a high probability that he will decide to save the family for the sake of his children. But he will never get over what she did to him that night. He'll have to live with this useless woman at least until his kids go to college." "But Dave—" I could see the wheels turning in Dee's head, but she couldn't finish her sentence. "And that's what you expect from me. If some fantastic stud seduces you on our date, I should let you go and be his for the night." This time I actually chuckled. "That will never happen, Dee." With a shrug, I said, "Enjoy your hotel room, I'll go home." "You can't leave me here alone." "You mean how Linda left him alone? Or how do you leave me alone while you sneak off to Mark or some other asshole and spend the night being his?" But she didn't get the chance. Dee's face turned red as soon as the words left her lips, realizing that she had made mistakes again. "I know I didn't get it, but you wanted it." I headed for the door and out into the hallway before Dee could respond. After exiting the elevator and walking through the hotel lobby, I happened to look to my left and saw Jim talking to the front desk clerk. When he finished, he turned and saw me standing 20 feet away. With fire in his eyes and clenched fists, he quickly closed the distance, and while he did this, I slowly put my hands in my pockets. I think that's the only reason he didn't punch me in the nose. Do you remember the weekend you and Linda joined Dee and I for a short vacation in New York? I asked the question, knowing that we both had fond memories of our time together that weekend just 2 years ago. While Dee and I regularly took short weekends in the Big Apple, Linda and Jim had never been there, even though both had lived within 3 hours of the city their entire lives. I continued, "What haunts me this weekend is the accident we passed on the way to New Haven Station." The fire and hatred began to disappear from Jim's eyes. "It seems you were the first to notice that all the flow of cars on the opposite side of the highway was diverted. It was like a ghost road. Cars were packed on our side, but the northbound lanes were completely empty. We knew there was going to be a terrible accident ahead, but I remember how angry I was. I couldn't believe that a stupid accident would delay us for an hour, ruining our plans for 3 days in the city. If I remember correctly, it took us about 90 minutes to slowly make our way through the traffic and get to the accident on the opposite side of the highway." Jim followed my story carefully, as I was sure that the accident had made a lasting impression on him. 3 vehicles, 2 cars and a van. I shook my head. The Church of Emmanuel was written on the side of the wagon. Each car had awnings covering all the windows, so we couldn't see the dead bodies inside. I looked at the floor, reliving the thoughts of that day. I don't know if I told you, but the next day I found information about the accident on the internet. 7 people died, and I was worried about missing an hour of partying while we were stuck in traffic. According to Jim straight to my face, I said, "I consider myself a decent person, but sometimes when I do something stupid, something shameful, I remember this damn mess of twisted steel and death, and how I used to worry about missing out. An hour of fun." I sighed and finished, "From now on, the way I behaved tonight will be etched in my memory as the most shameful moment of my life. I offer no excuses for my actions tonight. What I did is unforgivable. I don't know if it's possible to atone for your guilt, but I would like to call you sometimes. I won't be a bother, but if you need to meet someone for a beer or lunch, we could meet. We could talk or just watch the game." Tears filled Jim's eyes. There were tears in my eyes, too. "I'd like that," he replied, and nodded as he walked out the front door to catch a taxi home. "My name is David Wilson. I've been through my share of successes and failures and consider myself an average, friendly, hard-working guy. I am a landscape architect who is not afraid to get my hands dirty, and I have a master's degree from one of the top universities in the Northeast. My mom and dad own Shoreline Rocks, a chain of 6 locations selling decorative rocks, and pavers, serving coastal communities from Narragansett, Rhode Island to Bridgeport, Connecticut. From early spring to late fall, we have 18 trucks delivering stones to decorate commercial and residential properties. Our trucks are on the road from 5 a.m. to 8 p.m. My niche in the family business is designing walls, decks, and luxury backyards with pools and BBQ areas using our products. That was my job, at least until Mom and Dad died in a car accident during their annual pilgrimage to Florida every winter. I ran the business with the support of an incredibly loyal group of employees for almost 3 seasons. In some cases, we had a 3rd generation of families working for us, and everyone lent a helping hand when I needed it most. I met Dee at a large Knights of Columbus State event celebrating the opening of a new wing of St. Francis Hospital in Hartford. Knights of Columbus is an international Catholic organization in which each of our fathers was an active member. Dee and I were waiting at the bar for drinks. We talked, danced, and visited each parent's table. At 5'6" and 130 pounds of energy, I quickly fell in love with Dee. Her dark black hair, sparkling smile, D-cup breasts, and full round butt would help. Once dinner and the initiation ceremony were complete, Dee and I met at the bar and ran out. We spent the rest of the weekend at my apartment. Mutual attraction blossomed into love, and we were married 14 months later. We settled in Cheshire, Connecticut, an upscale town southwest of Hartford. Dee commuted 30 minutes to work at her father's real estate office in West Hartford. My travel time varied from 30 minutes to 2 hours depending on the site I was working at that day. I arrived at our house in Cheshire 20 minutes after leaving Jim in the hotel lobby. My phone was ringing non-stop with calls from Dee and several of our friends from our group. I let all calls go to voicemail and planned to listen to them in the morning. Quickly collecting 2 bags with clothes and necessary things, I headed towards the coast. In addition to my business, Mom and Dad left me a small, well-maintained, inside and out, year-round home on the Connecticut coast. It was in the tourist town of Mystic, Connecticut, and the backyard bordered a private beach. This house was supposed to be my refuge. Whether this would be short-term or long-term was yet to be decided. As usual, I got up early the next morning. It took me 2 cups of strong black coffee and a 90-minute walk on the beach before I felt half human. I listened to 6 voicemails, mostly from Dee, who said that I was very overreacted and I need to get home. 9 texts essentially said the same thing. I sent Dee a text message. I need time to think. I'll come home in 2 weeks at 2:00 p.m. and we'll talk. Please leave me alone until then. My mistake, as you might guess, was that I told Dee that I needed to think about it. Everyone knows that when a husband has been deeply hurt, the last thing his wife wants him to think about is it. No one will be surprised that they didn't leave me alone. The calls and messages started almost immediately. Luckily, I was familiar with an amazing technological innovation called caller ID. I set my calls to vibrate and all unwanted calls went to voicemail. Over the next few days, I was bombarded with calls on my cell phone and at each of my workplaces. It amazed me that it took Dee 5 days to make the 90-minute drive to Mystic, and she wasn't alone. As I was driving home that night, I caught a glimpse of my house from Route 1. I was approaching the driveway into my neighborhood, looked across the swamp between the highway and a row of houses, and saw 2 cars parked in my driveway. Instead of turning over, I continued driving to the store a mile down the road and called the Mystic police. After explaining the situation, the police officer asked, "What do you want us to do?" That was a good question. After a moment, I told her, "If they are sitting in their cars, tell them to drive away and not come back. If they're waiting on my porch, you write they are fined for trespassing on private property." Fines for trespassing on private property are common in tourist towns. This is the easiest way to help locals maintain a little privacy from visitors trying to see the ocean view from their private deck. I changed all the locks on the doors. If they are inside the house, it means they broke a window to get inside. In this case, I will sue them. The officer looked at me carefully. She wasn't trying to intimidate me, she just wanted to know, "Are you 100% sure?" "I'm sure," I told her. She grinned and said, "If they break a window to get into your house, I'll book them for trespassing, not breaking and entering. They face a fine of $1,000 instead of a fine of $125. Is this right for you?" When I asked, "Lethal injection is not an option," I heard the good laughter of both policemen. I was surprised when the senior officer asked, "You don't recognize me, do you?" I apologized, admitting, "I have no idea. I am Jen Wilcox. You dated my best friend Sally Cast for 1 summer." We chatted for a couple of minutes and Jen ended with, "I really hope things work out for you and your wife, but if they don't." Jen thought before asking, "Have you taken over your father's business?" "Yes. If things don't work out," she continued, "in my experience, an attractive guy with a successful business and a house by the sea will have a new girlfriend in about 17 seconds. Good luck, Dave." As agreed, I drove further along the coast to the pub for dinner. Waves is known for its gourmet burgers and ice-cold craft beer. It was a quiet evening. Officer Jen called me almost 2 hours later. "The coast is clean. Your wife and 4 friends were inside your house. They broke the glass on the back door to get in." "Hey, Jen, I appreciate all your help. I hope they didn't bother you too much. They were loud and stubborn until the handcuffs showed up. They scolded you and cried until they were released just a few minutes ago. I doubt they'll come back to Mystic, but you haven't made many friends today." I laughed and told her, "I may not have made any friends, but I did meet an old friend again." "You're still the same smooth talker, Dave. I'll let you buy me and my husband a beer if we ever run into you in town." "Cannot wait. See you." The text messages and voicemails continued, but I ignored them. I worked and reflected on myself and my needs. I also thought about Jim and the hell he was going through. I called him every week. To date, he had not made any long-term decisions and was not particularly willing to talk. During the second week of my absence, Dee and I exchanged several texts, confirming our private conversation at home. On the second Saturday after our night out, I was driving up to my neighborhood for the promised conversation with Dee when I had a strange premonition. At the last moment, instead of turning onto my street, I slowed down but continued to drive straight. I saw our driveway was empty and Dee had parked her car in the garage. The street seemed empty, and the only cars parked at the curb belonged to our neighbors. I turned right onto Cleaver Drive, which ran parallel to my street. At the intersection, I saw a group of cars parked along the road, which were clearly hidden from my view. I recognized my father-in-law's car, as well as the cars of Dee's two siblings, as well as several of our so-called long-time friends. I turned back and drove south toward my new home when my phone started ringing with a new bell sound like the Wicked Witch of the West. "Dave, where are you?" she asked. I could tell she had turned on the speakerphone option and the entire group could hear me. I decided not to come. Stunned, she said, "We confirmed our meeting twice, just this morning. What's happening?" "I have confirmed that we will have a private conversation about our future and not an intervention with your entire family and our traitorous friends." Dee was immediately interrupted by her father, who said, "Dave, I insist that you come back immediately. We are all here to help put this terrible episode behind us." "That's the problem, Michael. Much of this episode involves Dee lying, just as it does today. I cannot tolerate lies from my wife." "Dave," a new voice broke into our group conversation. "This is Linda." I admit that I was stunned that Linda spoke and politely replied, "Hello, woman of easy virtue." "I'm not a woman of easy virtue," Linda insisted. I couldn't help but laugh. "How many times?" I wanted to know. "Did you sleep with Mark? 5, 6? You'll stop me when I get to the right number, won't you?" "Jim survived it," Linda almost screamed. "He has forgiven me, and we are going to do this for each other and our family. Now it's your turn to stop this nonsense and get back to Dee." "Linda, someday we will run into each other, and when we do, I will ask you one question. It's funny, but I already know the answer to this question. The answer is not for my benefit, but for yours." Linda demanded, "What do you think you know?" I felt tension on the other end of the line as they waited for my response. "I know how many times Jim will make love to you compared to how many times he will just have sex with you." The roar that followed was deafening. Dee intervened to stop my further verbal attacks and somehow salvaged the call. She turned off speakerphone and told me, "Dave, I'm going to ask everyone to leave. Please come at 3 o'clock. I replied, "Don't worry about it, Dee. I really don't want to talk. I wanted to let you know personally that my lawyer filed for divorce on Friday. I was going to give you a copy of the documents and instructions from Phil on how to avoid getting a subpoena at work." "Divorce? Are you crazy?" She could hardly speak coherently. "Please, Dave," were the last words I heard as I ended the call. Since Connecticut's court system is one of the most efficient, fair, and client-friendly in the United States, it took until mid-July, 4 months later, before I heard from my lawyer. I spoke to Dee's lawyer yesterday. She will require counseling. I suspect the court will go her way when we finally go before a judge. Do you want to start now and finish this thing? I sighed and told Phil, "Deal. I don't care when the sessions are scheduled. The earlier the better. I have a feeling Dee will sign the divorce papers after the first session. Why do you think so? Phil wanted to know. With a sinister laugh, I replied, let's bet Tito's bottle against Knob Creek for me. Are you going to tell me more? He asked. No. 3 weeks later, at 2 a.m., on a Tuesday, I walked gingerly into the office of Dr. Allison McCoy, a marriage counselor. After I slowly and carefully lowered myself into the offered chair, Dee explained to the doctor, David is a landscape architect, and sometimes his back hurts at work. Is there anything I can do to make you more comfortable? Asked an attractive but plump therapist, about 50 years old. Wincing, I shook my head and said, if I sit still, I'm pretty comfortable. With a slight grin, Allison said, at least I can be sure there won't be any fights in my office today. Her joke caught me off guard and I laughed, then immediately winced. Please don't make me laugh, Doc. It hurts, was my sincere plea. After she lightly patted my knee, she began, I have read the divorce papers as well as the forms you filled out. I want to thank you both. Rarely do I receive such detailed questionnaires, and it's even rarer when two spouses agree with each other's claims. Allison looked at us in turn before continuing. Can I briefly summarize the situation? We both nodded and Allison said, ultimately, we're dealing with trust issues. Can David trust Deirdre not to give herself a free pass after telling him straight up that she'd like it too? Allison looked at her notes. Mark Lavalier chose her for a night of passion that Saturday night at the club. I thought our problem was more complex, but I had a plan and I didn't want to delay its implementation. Deirdre and I nodded in agreement with her statement. Allison asked me, can you think of anything Deirdre could do to begin the healing process and regain your trust? My nod took both women by surprise. Looking at them one by one, I said, Deirdre can agree that we won't have children. Dee shifted forward in her seat and almost exploded, but Allison intervened. If I understand the situation correctly, you and Deirdre discussed having children, and you changed your mind. Deirdre wants 5 children. I always thought 2 would be a good number. Until recently, I assumed that we would agree to 3, I explained. I will assume that the reason for your change of opinion was the events of that night in March. Can you explain your thoughts to Deirdre and me? It's simple. Over the past few months, I have been tormented by the thought that Deirdre publicly humiliates me and leaves with some famous athlete for a night of sex. It happened to my friend and Deirdre wanted it to happen to us. Or rather, she would like to have an affair and great sex, and I would be left with the reality of being an involuntary cuckold. I doubt she even thought about the consequences. My friend has 2 children. They are the only reason he stayed with his family. Honestly, I don't think I'm as strong as him, or I can't understand how much love he has for his children. Either way, I decided that I would never allow myself to be as vulnerable as my friend Jim. It sounds like Jim and his lifestyle had a big impact on that part of your life. Dee chimed in and said, Jim has stopped all contact with his friends. You have no idea how he really feels. I check in with Jim weekly, was my simple answer. Linda told me Jim doesn't talk to anyone, Dee argued, which immediately prompted Allison to ask, can you tell us how these conversations go? For the first few weeks, he didn't answer calls or call back. After 5 or 6 weeks, he started answering my calls, and we would talk for a few minutes at a time. Eventually, we started meeting for beers. Sometimes we just sit in silence and watch what's on the TV above the bar, and sometimes he needs to talk. I'm just listening. What did Jim tell you that made you change your mind about children? I don't think I'll tell you that. Why? Allison looked puzzled. I was expecting this question, but didn't spend much time trying to understand the full answer. Because Dee and Linda are friends. I don't trust Deirdre to keep my secrets. Anyway, we're getting off topic. My proposal remains the same. I will stop the divorce if Dee agrees that we will not have children. We will put off having children until our relationship is better. I sighed, looked Dee in the eye, and explained, I didn't hurt my back at work like you suggested. Yesterday I had the procedure. I'll be testing early next month to make sure. I don't want children. I thought Dee would pass out. Her mouth was wide open. When she came to, she muttered, "I can't believe you did this to me," and burst into tears before jumping out of her chair and running out of the room. I shrugged and told Allison, "I know kids are important to Dee. I think she will give the divorce a go." I extended my hand to her and said, "It was very nice to meet you, Allison." 2 months later, my lawyer and I were sitting in a small conference room with Dee, her father, and her lawyer. The Honorable Judge Charles Flick presided over the meeting. "Everything seems okay. Mrs. Deirdre Wilson agrees to divorce due to irreconcilable differences." Dee hissed, "Yes, this bastard had a procedure done to prevent himself from having children." Quick as lightning, Lawyer Dee grabbed her wrist as Judge Flick frowned and said, "I'll only tell you this once, watch your language." He looked at her for a moment and then turned and signed the papers finalizing my marriage. "Your divorce will become final in 90 days. Good luck to all." Dee's father, Michael, thanked the judge before asking, "Do you mind if we use your conference room for a few minutes? While I expect our conversation to be tense, I pledge that each of us will conduct ourselves as ladies and gentlemen." After a brief nod, Judge Flick said, "My next two cases are in my courtroom. Please limit your discussion to 30 minutes so that my bailiff can take a full lunch." Turning to the bailiff, Judge Flick continued, "I want you to stay here until their meeting is over. We'll be in the courtroom at 7 after lunch." After the judge left, Michael began, "I will never forgive you for the way you treated my daughter and the way you brought shame on our family. Having the procedure done was a disgusting act and the sign of a weak, selfish person. I expected nothing less from this pompous fool." I chuckled and looked at my lawyer. He shrugged, so I explained, "I agree that doing the procedure under these circumstances would be selfish, so I never did it. I'm not a selfish person. And ultimately, I want children. I just don't want to share them with your daughter." Surprised and stunned looks from the other side of the table before Dee's lawyer asked, "Did you lie to the judge?" I noticed that the bailiff's eyes were huge. "I didn't lie to the judge. I lied to my marriage counselor when Dee was with us. Dee repeated my lies to the judge. I was never asked to confirm this." My usually talkative ex-family remained silent as I turned our conversation to another topic. "I know I thanked you before, Michael, for recommending a forensic accountant after my father died. I was not prepared to run a company in every aspect. Not only did the accountant help me understand the nuances of my business, but he also saved me almost $14,000 a month in unnecessary expenses. These savings increased my cash flow, allowing me to add 2 crews and 3 trucks. These additions have increased sales." To say that people on the opposite side of the table were puzzled by my thoughts about business carries means not to say anything. I continued, "I was so impressed with the accountant that he hired him for a second in-depth assessment. He recommended that he do a quick assessment of my personal finances as Dee and I were starting to get divorced. Discovered it was a little out of order. It was a secret Discover credit card in Dee's name." Dee leaned towards the table and said, "We don't need to go into detail." I smiled at her before turning my attention back to Michael. He couldn't tell me anything more about the card until I was able to tell him the card number, expiration date, and CVV code. I was curious why my wife had a secret card, so I snuck into our house early in the morning around 2 a.m. "Did you ignore the restraining order?" her lawyer nearly roared. I replied, "There was never a restraining order, idiot. Anyway," Dee interrupted him again. "Please," she begged. "My accountant was able to identify 17 allegations over the past year and a half. Obviously, his methods were illegal, but that doesn't matter. I will never use evidence in a courtroom. We found 8 charges at Victoria's home. Secret, and charged 2 days after each purchase for a 4-hour daytime hotel stay at Starlight at the Meriden end of the Berlin Main Line." Michael's face turned white and Dee's face turned beet red. The look on their lawyer's face told me he wanted to be anywhere other than the conference room. The bailiff had a great time. I hired a private investigator, and he was able to obtain CCTV footage from around the Starlight Hotel where Dee was having her afternoon parties. We have identified 8 different married men that Dee had affairs with and sent the evidence to their wives. They should receive the evidence today, and I expect your sweet, innocent daughter to be named in several divorce cases. The room was silent for a few moments as everyone worked out the ramifications. I continued, "That's 16 out of 17 charges." Dee jumped up from her seat. "Please, Chris, if you ever loved me." The remaining amount was $1,360 and was payable to Planned Parenthood of Connecticut. The payment was for a procedure to get rid of pregnancy. Focused on Dee like a laser, I asked, "Do you know if you killed my baby or the baby of one of the idiots you slept with?" She was silent, and her eyes were filled with hatred. I shrugged, looked at Michael, and told him, "I will never know if your daughter killed my child, but we all know for sure that she killed your grandson." I stood up from my chair and, along with my lawyer, left Dee and her exhausted family behind. In early December, I closed our businesses for the winter. I decided I needed a break, and, as my parents had done for decades, I headed to Florida. Using Airbnb, I started in Pensacola and traveled to the next southern Florida Gulf Coast city every Saturday until I arrived in Miami. After a week in Miami, I headed north along the state's Atlantic coast, moving every week, and finally, at the end of February, I flew home from Jacksonville. I admit that I did a lot of unhealthy things while on vacation. I drank too much, ate greasy restaurant food, and slept with more women in 3 months than in the previous 32 years. The only good habit I picked up was going to the gym every day and running 3 miles on the sandy beach. I haven't run for almost 10 years. It was incredibly difficult to start because my whole body was sore, but after a few weeks I wanted a new morning ritual. A few weeks after returning from Florida, I was running on the beach. My daily run consisted of a half-mile on the sand to downtown Mystic, 2-mile jogging through the city center, and I ended up retracing my steps along the beach. As is my habit, I began a silent prayer as I passed Simon's grocery store on First Avenue. If today were the last day, a stunning woman would be running around the corner of Steeple Drive, a quarter of a mile in front of me. It may sound silly, but the highlight of my day was saying a joyful good morning to the woman of my dreams as I walked past her. My smile was ear to ear when I saw her turn the corner and head towards me on the opposite side of the street. Today's outfit was a tight orange and black top that ended just above her belly button and tight black running shorts. Her hair was pulled back into a ponytail and swayed from side to side with every step. Her body is gorgeous with small B-cups, a flat stomach, and long and athletic legs. About halfway towards me, she turned to the middle of the street and ran around a car parked on the side of the road. Instead of turning back to the curb, the woman continued on my side of the street, and when we were 30 yards apart, she stopped, spread her legs, and put her hands on her hips. I slowed down as I approached her, and then stopped, smiled, and said, "Good morning," like I did every day. She looked at me and asked, "Good morning?" When I didn't answer, she narrowed her eyes and repeated in irritation, "Good morning?" I was confused. With pity in her voice, she asked, "Don't you have a game?" I had several answers on the tip of my tongue, but I knew none of them were correct. She continued, "I mean, any game at all." I honestly don't know how it happened, but I stepped towards her and without hesitation, kissed her. She didn't pull away, and neither did I. I thought I had won the lottery. "Hello, I'm Dave Wilson." She laughed so much that early in the morning the city street was filled with laughter. "Hi, David. Dave Wilson, I'm Jillian McBride. I'm glad we finally met." With another laugh, she admitted, "God, I hate running, but I love seeing you every morning." Not that I'm complaining, but if you hate running, why do you go outside every day? And why do you have so many different running outfits? Jillian looked at me for a few seconds. She seemed to be trying to size me up. I don't know what she saw in my eyes, but it must have been something good. 3 weeks ago I had to work. She pointed behind me and towards Front Street. The car damaged the sign in front of my pediatric medical office, and it leaned at an angle. 3 days later, when the man I hired to fix it arrived at my office, I saw that someone had already fixed the sign. The sign was straight, and the tire tracks had been cleaned up. After meeting my last patient, I looked at the security camera and saw you running down the street at the same time every day. One day, I saw you studying a sign and taking notes. The next day, at the same time, you returned with the help of several tools and spent nearly 45 minutes straightening the sign and repairing the damage to the lawn. I decided that I need to meet you. When it comes to outfits, I'm a girl and I want to look my best. I spent a small fortune to get you to notice me. I admit my ego doubled, and at the same time I found myself at a loss. Jillian blushed, smiled, and realized she had some explaining to do. I'm not really a runner. I've synced my phone with the security cameras, and I'm waiting on Staple Street until I see you walking past my office. I wait another minute and start running. We pass each other, smile, and greet each other, and I run 2 more blocks before turning and walking home. I really hate running. My knees have been screaming for the last 2 days, so I insisted on meeting today. She smiled proudly. My heart was beating in my chest. I had a pretty good week at work, planning to treat myself to dinner at Queenie's tonight. Will you join me? Queenie's is a local lobster bar serving the best lobster rolls and fried fish in the area. There is no seating inside the bar, but there are about 40 picnic tables scattered around. Jillian may have hurt herself somehow from smiling so big. I would like that. I would really like to. I'm working in Fairfield County today and won't be back until 7:15 or 7:30. Queenie's kitchen closes at 8. Do you mind meeting there? I promise I'll be there before closing, but it will be back to back. Jillian leaned in and initiated our second long kiss. When we broke up, she said, "I can't wait." She turned around and started running back. She was half a block ahead, and I had just turned away after admiring her slender figure, long legs, and gorgeous butt. She shouted back, "You know I'm a doctor. What are you doing?" I shouted, "I'm selling stones." I saw her brow furrow as she asked, "What are you selling?" Looking quickly around, I picked up a small stone about an inch in diameter. Holding it between my thumb and forefinger, I shouted, "I sell stones. This one is good. I'll sell it to you for $3. Jillian's laughter reverberated off the downtown buildings. She waved her hand and said, "You'll be funny. See you tonight." Heavy rain hit Fairfield County in southwestern Connecticut this afternoon. I stopped work and everyone headed home. I was home in Mystic by 5:30 and watched from my deck as the clouds rolled in over Long Island, New York. When I heard thunder in the distance an hour later, and knowing that Queenie's was closing in the rain, I headed there early. I didn't know Jillian's preferences, so I bought a lot of food. Ordered a lobster roll for both of us, fried shrimp, fried scallops, and fried mussels, and a large portion of potato balls topped with cheese and bacon. I had only been in the car for a minute when the sky opened up and pouring rain hit us. The parking lot quickly emptied, and I sat listening to country music. My car was the only one in the parking lot when a sporty red Mini Cooper came barreling in. He stopped in the middle of the parking lot. Since my car was the only one, the car carefully approached my pickup truck. "I was so craving a lobster roll tonight," Jillian shouted over the sound of rain hitting our cars. I finished work early. When I heard the thunder, I came and ordered enough food to feed the army. My knight in shining armor. I jumped out of my car and quickly handed Jillian my driver's license before ducking back into the cab. It didn't matter how fast I moved. I was soaked to the skin. I shouted back, "Call a trusted friend and give him my name and address. This way you can feel safe coming to my house for dinner." Jillian looked at me in surprise, then nodded and made the call. After disconnecting, Jillian said, "I have a follow-up call at 9 p.m. Don't let me forget. You lead, I'll follow you." We got home in 15 minutes, each of us looking like a wet rat after the short run from the car to my door. "Let me get you a sweater, sweatpants, and a towel for your hair." She replied, "Okay, but first," and she kissed me. I'm not a spontaneous person. I think long and hard about most things. But in my head, I was screaming, "It's too early to tell her I love you. It's too early to tell her I love you. Don't do it. Don't do it." We ate and kissed. We looked at the lightning and kissed. We talked about everything in the world and kissed. When the doorbell rang at 10:45, Jillian looked at me and said, "It shouldn't be a friend." I had no idea who might be at the door and answered with a smile, "Absolutely not." When the door swung open, I was the first to notice the family resemblance between Jillian and the man. It took me a moment to recognize Officer Jen Wilcox as she was wearing jeans, a t-shirt, and a raincoat. "Hey, Jillian," I shouted. "We forgot about your test call." "Oh shit, I left my phone in the car," she yelled back. I heard bare feet running through the house. Jillian looked great to me, but I guess she looked ridiculous to her family. She had changed into a men's oversized hoodie and sweatpants, and her hair was disheveled. "I'm really sorry," she hugged Jen and Jeff as I invited them into my home. We had a drink together and Jillian explained that her sister and brother were both police officers and that Jen I left my maiden name. When her family saw how comfortable she was, they decided to leave us alone. "Nothing personal, Chris. Jillian, will you call me when you get home? I don't care what time," Jen demanded. Jillian looked at her sister for a few seconds before turning to me. I couldn't figure out what she was thinking until she said to Jen, "I'm not coming home tonight." She quickly turned to me and said, "We won't have sex, but I want to be with you. Agree?" "I can't imagine anything better." I nodded. As promised, we didn't have sex that night. I woke up at some point. Stupidly, I asked, "What about our agreement?" Her eyes sparkled. "It's morning, fool." Jillian stayed until Sunday evening. On Saturday, we went hiking, visited a brewery, and grilled steaks in my backyard. We sunbathed naked, swam at night without swimsuits, and made love. I was raised in a strict Roman Catholic family, but stopped going to church after my parents died. On Sunday, I went to Mass for the first time since their funeral. As we left the church, Jillian leaned over and whispered, "Every Sunday, please?" We stood next to Jillian's car as she prepared to leave on Sunday evening. We kissed for a while when she pulled away. She said, "I." She couldn't finish her thoughts, but her eyes were pleading, and I knew what she wanted to say. "I love you too," I replied. Jillian and I became inseparable. She enjoyed fishing from my motorboat as much as I enjoyed riding on her catamaran. We took weekend trips to Montreal, New York, and Washington, D.C. for the first few months of our relationship. The close friendships I formed with Dee's brothers and brothers-in-law were quickly replaced by equally strong connections with Jillian's family and friends. Jillian, as a respected pediatrician, was a true star in the mystic community. We never went anywhere that Jillian wasn't loved and respected, and we were always surrounded by fun people. I haven't met Jillian's parents for almost 5 months. Her father is a doctor of chemical sciences and a member of the executive committee of Merck, an international pharmaceutical company with American headquarters in Connecticut. Her father suffered a serious heart attack, and after recovering, he took time off to travel around the United States in an RV with his wife. A week after they returned to Connecticut, Jillian and I invited Sandra and Thomas over for dinner. Having spent so much time with Jillian, her 3 brothers and 2 sisters, their spouses and 14 children, and many friends, I assumed that Jillian's parents were ordinary people. I wasn't worried about meeting them, and we had a wonderful evening. Our conversation that night revolved around me, as Tom and Sandy wanted to get to know me better and were genuinely interested in my life. Tom asked me about my business and laughed when I called myself a stone salesman. He correctly assumed that I sell many thousands of tons of stone every season and make good money. I was surprised to learn that Tom was involved with the Knights of Columbus, like my father and Dee's father. He wanted to know about my Roman Catholic faith, and I admitted that it had been undermined by the death of my parents. Jillian intervened and explained that we go to church together every week, and I jokingly said that she was trying to save my black soul. Sandy was more interested in my friendship with her family. She heard many stories about my participation in various activities during phone calls while she and Tom were traveling. She was pleased that I had adapted so well and integrated into her clan. Sandy tried to find out about my other friendships outside of her immediate family. The conversation was good-natured, but every time I laughed and deflected the question, I saw Jillian mulling over something until she finally exclaimed, "That bitch." Her outburst surprised my parents and upset me, as I suspected that our conversation would take an unpleasant direction. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she moaned, "That damn bitch." She jumped out of her chair and jumped into my lap, hugging me around the neck, sobbing on my shoulder. I smiled at her very confused parents and told them, "Jillian has finally put the pieces of the puzzle of my dark period of life together." Jillian moaned and hugged my neck tighter. After making a long fake choking noise and getting hit on the back 3 times for teasing Jillian, I explained, "My mom and dad were only children like me. When they died, I had no brothers, no sisters, no aunts, no uncles, no cousins. I was left alone except for my ex-wife's family. My brothers-in-law were my best friends, as well as several of Dee's friends' husbands. I lost them in the divorce. Of course, your brothers-in-law and friends support you as much as they could," Sandy insisted. "Unfortunately, it did not happen. Jillian will tell you about my divorce another time, but the point is I was single and very unhappy for almost a year." We sat at the table on the deck, and I looked around my yard and the ocean beyond and said, "Sometimes I wondered if this house would ever be a home again." I finished with a shrug. Looking straight at me, Tom suggested, "If this isn't home yet, it will be soon." He gave me a significant look. Turning to Tom, I said, "My plan was to give you a month to get used to being back home after traveling, and then invite you out for a beer. I would like to share my short and long-term plans and how they will affect your daughter." When the meaning of my words reached everyone, Sandy and Jillian looked at Tom. He gave me a hard look and said, "If you have anything to tell me, say it now." The women turned their gaze to me again. "I'm in love with your daughter. She is my best friend. I would like to have your and Sandy's blessing, and I would like her to be my wife. I will try every day to make her as happy as she makes me." Tom's hard expression turned into a beaming smile as he barked, "Damn, you will." When I turned to Jillian, her eyes were wide, and she said, "Yes, yes, yes." The decision to marry Jillian was an easy one, but it was strengthened over and over again by the small, seemingly insignificant things we did for each other all the time. I never had a nickname until Jillian started calling me Rock. In less than a month, family, friends, co-workers, and clients took it up, and I became a year for everyone, and together we became Rock and Doc. I asked Jillian when she started calling me David again, and she explained, "I'm willing to share the rock, but I want David to be all mine." Jillian and I love country music and attend small, medium, and large concerts every few weeks. There was a period when she canceled our concert date 5 times in a row over several months. Jillian had 2 partners. Both were married with children, so Jillian took on half the calls at night and on weekends when patients were unwell. Jillian wanted her partners to be at home with the children. Jillian texted me and said, "If you're not too mad at me, I'd like to come." It was 9:30 on the 5th night when she canceled the date. I quickly replied, "Great." When she walked through the door 20 minutes later, she stopped and looked stunned. "What's happening?" she asked. I gave the concert tickets to Jen and Jeff and offered to take the kids for the night. Jillian's 7-year-old nephew slept on the other end of the sofa. Her 4-year-old niece slept with her head on my knee, and her baby, an 18-month-old, slept on my chest. "Aren't you mad at me?" she asked. "For caring for sick children and worried parents, really." Jillian admitted, "My last 3 relationships ended because of my off-hours challenges." I hope one day you will understand that I am not an asshole. I'm in this for the long haul, and I'm not going anywhere." And smiling, he added, "The children and I had dinner at Queenie's. There are 2 in the refrigerator, lobster roll and wine." Jillian helped me put the kids to bed, and after we ate lobster rolls and drank a glass of Pinot, she led me into the bedroom. Jillian and I got married on the first Saturday of summer next year. The wedding took place in the Catholic Church in the center of Mystic, a small church building in the traditional New English style. I followed Father McSweeney and my best man Jeff, Jillian's brother, out of the altar, and was puzzled to see all 230 guests seated on the groom's side. Almost immediately, the organist began playing Bach's favorite piece, and the church doors swung open. Officer Jen, as a witness, walked down the aisle first. My confusion increased when Jen stood next to Jeff and, like everyone else, ended up on my side of the altar. Jen was followed moments later by a beaming Thomas, who nodded and acknowledged each of his guests, and in his arms, my bride, who never took her eyes off me. When they reached me, in front of the altar, Father McSweeney began the ceremony by asking, "Who will bring this woman to this man in marriage?" The surprises continued as each family member and friend responded with Thomas, "We." After quickly looking around at the guests, Jillian turned to me and said, "You have one hell of a family, Rock. Is there room for one more?" At that moment, I realized that Jillian was telling me that I would never be alone again and that I had become part of a big, wonderful family. 16 years later, Jillian walked down the aisle of St. Joseph's Cathedral in Hartford. She was followed by our 14-year-old twin daughters, Mallory and Caitlin, and our 11-year-old twin sons, James and Matthew. I brought up the rear. We were in Hartford to celebrate my father-in-law's installation as a Grand Knight, or Grand Poob, as the family called him. Connecticut Knights of Columbus Chapter. The investiture ceremony and mass were to be followed by a banquet at the Hartford Marriott Hotel. It was a big event with more than 800 invitees and guests. The first 5 rows to the left of the main aisle were reserved for the new Grand Knights family, and as I sat down in the 5th row, I caught a glimpse of the outgoing Grand Knights family sitting to the right of the aisle. I was stunned. "I can't believe it," I thought, although I think I said it out loud. My brother-in-law, Steve, turned and asked, "You can't believe what?" I leaned over to Steve and whispered, "My father-in-law is succeeding my former father-in-law as Grand Poob." Steve thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. He laughed and passed on the news. When word reached Jillian, she laughed the loudest and whispered, "This is going to be epic." Later, at the reception, I was standing in line at the bar when I heard, "Deja vu, Dave." I smiled as I turned toward the voice, remembering how we first met in line at the bar at a Knights of Columbus event nearly 2 decades ago. "Good to see you, Dee." I leaned over and kissed her on the cheek. She looked great and was still sexy as hell. "You have a beautiful family. I am happy for you." "Thank you, Deirdre. What about you?" She made a stupid smile and admitted, "I have been divorced 3 times and have no children." And then she giggled and said, "My husband has cheated, so I know how bad it is." We exchanged pleasantries as we moved down the line to the bar. I had a drinks list for my family and ordered a gin and tonic for Dee. When all the drinks were ready, Jillian came over and said, "I figured you and Dee wanted to talk. Take your drinks and I'll bring the rest to our table." And then she reached out and said, "Hi, Deirdre. I'm Jillian, and I'm very pleased to meet you." Deirdre was also friendly and replied, "You have wonderful children, and I know for a fact that your husband is a wonderful guy." Their smiles seemed sincere. Jillian took the tray of drinks and Dee, and I found a quiet spot along the wall. "Did you know that all the couples in our group got divorced?" "I didn't know this, but I'm not surprised. The only person I keep in touch with is Jim." "What Jim did to Linda was terrible," Dee said with confidence. "Was what Jim did to Linda terrible? Are you kidding me?" I sighed and decided not to argue and just end our conversation. "It was good to see you, Dee. Take care of yourself." As I walked through the ballroom to the smiling crowd of family waiting for my return, I remembered the story Jim told me. He and Linda drove their youngest child from Connecticut to the University of Miami in a U-Haul truck. After unloading the contents of the truck in Shelley's room, they returned the U-Haul, and before heading to the airport for their flight home, they stopped at an upscale seafood restaurant for an early dinner. After they were seated, Jim lied to Linda, saying he needed to go to the bathroom. He passed the bailiff as he was leaving the restaurant. 3 minutes later, Jim was in a taxi on his way to the airport when he answered Linda's panicked call. "What are you doing, Jim?" she demanded. Jim calmly told her, "I don't have to stay with you anymore for the sake of the kids. I want a divorce." "What? What? What am I going to do?" she asked in despair. "You're lucky," Jim replied. "Mark Lavalier retired from the Miami football team and still lives in the city. Call him. This time you don't have to limit yourself to one night." Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even click to the next one.